Hello, everyone, and welcome to this virtual 129th Continental Congress special presentation. I'm Tracy Robinson, NSDAR's Director of Archives and History. Today, we'll take a brief look at the history of DAR members' involvement in the women's suffrage movement and see a few items from the NSDAR archives and the Americana collection as well. Summer 2019 marked the beginning of the women's suffrage centennial commemoration, as the proposed 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was sent to the states for ratification on June 4, 1919. Ratification was complete on August 18, 1920, and on August 26, this simple sentence was enshrined forever in the Constitution. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. As many of you know, we currently have on display in the Americana Room an exhibit that highlights the accomplishments of a very select group of DAR members who were active in reform activities during the Progressive Era, an approximately 30-year period of history which culminated in the granting of suffrage rights to American women. The time period is remembered for increased opportunities for women's and children's education, the founding of women's clubs, health and safety reform in the areas of housing and medicine, an increase in philanthropic efforts, mobilization on the home front to provide aid during both the Spanish-American War and World War I, and, of course, the women's suffrage movement. 5 DAR members prominent during this era were Clara Barton, Frances Willard, Jane Addams, Susan B. Anthony, and Alice Paul. Much like what happened to labor in the U.S. during World War I and World War II, the growth of the armies during the Civil War created a manpower shortage. Women were called on to mobilize in an enormous effort to make sure military hospitals, especially those in the field, had adequate labor and supplies. Clara Barton is best remembered for founding the American Red Cross in 1881. However, at the beginning of the Civil War, Miss Barton worked to obtain medical supplies to distribute to wounded soldiers. In July 1862, she was granted permission to travel behind Army lines to care for the wounded. This is an image of Clara Barton's calling card while president of the American National Association of the Red Cross. And this is a handwritten note from Clara Barton to Violet Blair Gavin, dated November 7, 1894, recommending a friend for membership in DAR, quote, even if her ancestors had been Tories. Offended or frightened by common assumptions regarding ill-mannered drunkards, some reformers embraced prohibition as a means of calming fears of social disorder by keeping poor or working-class men sober, self-disciplined, and on time for work. When Frances Willard, president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, swept through the southern states on a speaking tour in the 1880s, women flocked to her lectures. A woman of great faith, Miss Willard said she was inspired to support women's suffrage during a conversion experience that occurred while she was preparing a temperance lecture. For Miss Willard, temperance and women's suffrage were well paired. She reasoned that allowing women to vote would increase electoral support for prohibition legislation and enable women's redemptive influence to suffuse the entire society. Today, in a lasting tribute to her efforts as a social reformer, a statue of Frances Willard stands in the U.S. Capitol as part of the National Statuary Hall collection. She was the first woman to be so honored. This image is of a letter to DAR from the National Women's Christian Temperance Union regarding plans for an exhibit at DAR headquarters in celebration of Frances Willard's 100th birthday in 1939. And this is a photo of that exhibit at DAR headquarters honoring Miss Willard's centennial birthday. The settlement movement began officially in the U.S. in 1886. A settlement house was an institution in an inner-city area that provided educational, recreational, and other social services to underprivileged communities. Volunteer, middle-class settlement workers lived on site, sharing knowledge and culture with, and alleviating the poverty of, their low-income neighbors. In 1889, Jane Addams co-founded the most well-known of the settlement houses, Hull House in Chicago. Named for its original occupant, Hull House was, quote, a fine old house standing well back from the street. With its innovative social, educational, and artistic programs, Hull House became the standard bearer for the movement that had grown to almost 500 settlement houses nationally by 1920. In addition to her dedication to Hull House and her life as a social worker, Miss Addams became a committed pacifist in the years leading up to World War I and helped to found the Woman's Peace Party. She co-founded the American Civil Liberties Union in 1920. As a result of her work, Miss Addams received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. She was the first American woman to receive the honor. This image is of Jane Addams with other American delegates to the International Congress of Women, which was held in the Netherlands at The Hague in 1915. The 1920 presidential election marked the first time in American history that women were able to vote legally throughout the nation. Previously, a few states gave women partial or full voting rights. The Wyoming Territory was first to give women the right to vote in 1869. Although she died in 1906 and did not get to see her dream of women's suffrage come true, Susan B. Anthony was a staunch and unrelenting supporter of women's rights who worked tirelessly throughout her life to secure women the right to vote. Raised a Quaker, Miss Anthony taught for a time at a Quaker seminary. Her discovery that the male teachers at her school earned higher pay than she earned for equal work inspired her to join the women's rights movement. Later, an introduction to Elizabeth Cady Stanton further solidified her beliefs in women's equality to men, and she dedicated her life to ensuring women's civil rights. This is an image of a letter from Susan B. Anthony to Indiana Republican Congressman Thomas McClelland Brown. Miss Anthony and several other women appeared before Congress in the days following the National Woman Suffrage Association's 16th Annual Washington Conference in March 1884. The women testified in support of a 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, giving women the right to vote. This letter to friend and colleague Ella Jones illustrates Miss Anthony's determination and somewhat one-track mind on matters concerning women's rights. On the occasion of Miss Jones's mother's death in 1897, Miss Anthony wrote, "I have not met your dear mother in many years, but have always kept her in my list of honored and effective pioneer friends of suffrage." She goes on to assert that, quote, The only real pleasure in living is in the feeling that we are helping to lift the world along toward the brighter and better. Women's rights activist Alice Paul was born in New Jersey in 1885. She got an early start in her work for women's rights, often attending suffrage meetings with her mother. In 1912, she joined the National American Woman Suffrage Association and was appointed chairman of the organization's Congressional Committee in Washington. Her activities initially consisted of strategic planning and fundraising. In 1913, Miss Paul and her colleague, Lucy Burns, broke from the National American Woman Suffrage Association and founded the National Woman's Party in order to fight for suffrage on the national level and prioritize the passage of a constitutional amendment ensuring women's suffrage throughout the country. This is an image of the official program from the women's suffrage procession held in Washington, D.C. on March 3, 1913. By 1916, Miss Paul and her colleagues began to implement the more assertive tactics used by suffragists in England, such as parades, hunger strikes, and suffrage watchfires. In 1917, Miss Paul participated in what may have been the first political protest to picket in front of the White House. She was arrested along with other participants and sent to a Washington, D.C. jail. Miss Paul proceeded to organize a hunger strike and endured forced feedings, beatings, and other forms of torture, including sleep deprivation. A prison physician said of her, "She has a spirit like Joan of Arc, and it is useless to try to change it. She will die, but she will never give up." This is Miss Paul celebrating the passage of the 19th Amendment by unfurling a suffrage banner from the balcony of the National Woman's Party headquarters in Washington. Thank you very much for listening. Best wishes for good health, and I hope we'll see all of you again soon at National Headquarters.